Welcome to Art in the Raw, the podcast that explores the bold, unapologetic, and often unseen art of queer creators. I'm your host, David Smith. Each episode, we sit down with queer artists from different disciplines to explore their inspirations, their struggles, and the narratives that shape their work. Welcome back to Art in the Raw. I'm David Smith. Tom Calloway's photography of beautiful men has this incredible way of capturing masculinity and sensuality with a raw, authentic edge. His images play with light across the body and just makes you feel something. I've been a fan for a while, so I was really excited to sit down with him recently to dive into his creative process, what inspires him, and the stories behind his most striking pieces. This is going to be a good one. Welcome to Art in the Raw. All right, we've got Tom Calloway with us today. How are you, Tom?
I'm doing well.
Good. Thanks for
Thanks
joining
for
me
the
today.
invite.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to start off each interview with an artist asking who they are. Who is Tom Calloway?
Sure. Well, specific to the photography, I've been doing this a little bit over a decade now, and I just kind of fell into it actually. I'm not a photographer, professional photographer by trade. I'm actually an educator, but I was part of a community of yoga community, men's nude yoga. And
Mhm.
basically, at one point, the instructor to the class knew that I liked photography, that I'd been a hobbyist for a long time, and asked me to photograph the class. And I was surprised, actually, because I was like, first of all, no one's going to show up to this class and be photographed naked for a yoga class at this point. He was like, oh, wait, you'll just wait and find out.
Yeah.
He did all of the prep work and had everybody sign releases and all that kind of stuff. And it was like the best attended class of that class in a long time.
Everybody wanted to be taking
Everybody
pictures
wanted to
of
be
him.
photographed, and so it was a lot of fun. There were probably 40 men, and it was a great experience for me just to have a first time kind of photographing the male figure. The
Mhm.
nice thing about that yoga class was, men of all shapes and sizes, colors, and so that just kind of led into some of the men in the class were like, well, would you photograph me, and that kind of stuff. And then I just started posting back then on Instagram, and it just kind of took off from there, and people started self-referring. I started reaching out to men, and a decade later, I'm still doing it and having fun.
You said the yoga instructor knew that you were interested in photography. What was your interest? Were you already doing it on the side, taking pictures of things? What was that you were taking pictures of, maybe?
A couple of different things, actually. I mean, just the kind of things that most people do, nature photography, things like that. But I also have, it's kind of an odd connection, but I have a affinity for tiki bars, and so I had started photographing the interiors of tiki bars across the U.S., which is completely different from photographing people. But he just knew that I liked photography, and I think he thought I had a good eye.
There's an amazing one in Portland that I visited before. It's a very
Oh,
unique
really?
space. That
Yeah,
might be it.
yeah.
It's been a while since I've been there, but yeah, it was pretty cool. So your Instagram bio says that I trust only the lens of my eye, all that is best of dark and bright. Elaborate on that philosophy for us.
Well, the light and dark is definitely my fascination with how light interacts on the body. I am an artist of a lot of different kinds of mediums, and I did some stained glass work for a while, and I really loved how light interacted with color and glass. And so when it comes to photography, I'm fascinated by, how natural light or other sources of light just really accentuate. So that's the light and dark. All I trust is, my lens at this point is that's a bit tongue in cheek because in some ways the photographer's role is to, well, at least the way I see it, is that you're also creating something that's a bit of a story, and you're also creating something that, in my mind, is beautiful. I know other photographers approach their art as more like photojournalism or something like that, where you're showing something raw. That's not really my approach. My approach
So
is
you're trying to
more,
create something that you're
yeah,
taking a picture of, not just document what you see.
correct. And so I think, the way I kind of described how I approach photographing men is that I want to find the space between something that is, just portraiture and something that is more pornographic. I want to find the space that is more sensual. And so that's what really draws me in, is just trying to, In some ways, I think it's very much how painters, in the past couple of centuries have viewed women. It's the male gaze or whatever. I think that kind of happens for me in the photographer's eye. It's portraying the sensual of the body.
Gotcha. So you want to take photos of men in situations that are appealing to you as a gay man, essentially.
I think
Yeah.
so. That's certainly accurate.
Are there particular other photographers or artists who influenced your work? You mentioned, I think, the old masters, the old Greek. How does that impact your vision?
Well, in terms of, artists, not photographers, Caravaggio's work with light and that kind of starkness is definitely in my mind. I love kind of thinking in terms of that. In terms of photographers, gosh, I'm kind of blanking on specific names to give you, but very early on in Instagram, I was a follower of Immortal Form.
Oh
Immortal
yeah.
Form is out of Canada, and I loved his sense of use of light and particularly how he was using strong reds and blues, which in my mind are the most difficult colors to photograph on the body because they tend to wash out detail, things like that.
Hmm.
And so I was just fascinated with how he was capturing light.
Nice.
Blake Little,
Yeah.
I really like Blake's work because Blake does capture kind of what I'm looking for too. You look at his photographs and there's something very sensual about them. Men that are dressed, men that are undressed. There's just kind of an undercurrent of something there, and I like how he captures that.
Yeah. Almost not posed or staged, but somehow captures the sensuousness of whoever he's photographing. I believe you live in Charlotte.
Not
How
Charlotte.
does
I'm actually in Durham, North Carolina.
Gotcha. Okay. How does that environment influence your art living in that area?
Oh, that's a good question. It does make it sometimes a challenge to find models, over time. Certainly, if models are traveling to the area or something like that, finding someone new who wants to model. It's not that it's horrible here, but, Raleigh, Durham is not a huge, tourist center or something like that.
Yeah.
So I tend to travel quite a bit. So I guess the way it influences me, I tend to travel all over the US. And as I'm traveling, I'll reach out to men and see if they want to be photographed. So I've been really fortunate to have those connections when I travel. In terms of how it influences me too here, I really like the outdoors and photographing men outdoors. And so it is nice that North Carolina has 4 seasons, although so it gives me variety of looks, except for this time of the year when I'm not going to invite somebody out into the 20-degree weather to be photographed. So, yeah.
Process a little bit. Walk us through a little bit of what your typical process is when you're planning a new shoot with a model, and executing. How much planning ahead of time do you do, and how much is it just ad hoc, figuring it out when you get there?
If I have the planning time, I mean, certainly I have done shoots where it's like I'll reach out to someone and they want to do a shoot that day or something, then there's not a lot of time for planning. But when I do have time to plan, I like to have conversation with the model because I feel like if I'm just throwing something onto the model, they're not connected to it. So typically I'll have conversations about what are the things you enjoy doing. Kind of like what you said about Blake's work, I think the best photographs are not posed. And so I'm trying to look for what are the interests of that person and how do I incorporate their interest into, if we go out into the woods or something like that, if someone likes hiking, then I'm going to be saying, um, hike for me. Don't think about standing still because that will translate to the camera as you standing still posing for a shot.
Yep.
So, I tend to take a whole lot of pictures when I take. My camera's constantly going. And that's because what I've found is that it's the in between moments that
Mhm.
actually make the difference in the shot. And so, for a 1 or 2 hour shoot, I'll have 2,000, images to go through to see what is the best shot, those kinds of things. So,
I've done that same thing where you get back and you're like overwhelmed by how many images you've
yeah.
got to cull through. Which one do I pick? Which one did I throw away? So looking through your portfolio, there's quite the diverse range of bodies that you photograph. Um, how do you choose? the type of model that you want to photograph? Do you are you looking to get diversity in your photographs versus the standard kind of muscular, ribbed male form that we see so much in queer culture?
Yeah, I'll say I'm just like every other gay man. Certainly, I'm torn between those two worlds. So to say that I am never influenced by, that muscle bear out there that wants to be photographed, that would be not honest. But that said, I am looking for diversity. Honestly, it's really the face that draws me in. If someone has a very interesting face and structure, that's typically where I start. And that's what will draw me into photographing that person. The face is so expressive, that kind of stuff. And so, I often have men who like my work who are like, can you photograph me without my face? I'm like, yeah, no, that's just not me. So yeah, it's typically the face. Yes, I like to see lots of different body shapes at this point. I really do believe that sensual comes in lots of shapes. Again, I guess it's going back to how light interacts with the body, things like that, that makes the shot more interesting to me.
Yeah,
I love tattoo work, and so I love seeing, how tattoo also plays with light, that kind of stuff.
beautiful work with tattoos I saw
Thank you.
in your portfolio. So you mentioned light a little earlier. You just mentioned playing with light. How do you approach your lighting on a subject? Do you try to focus on natural light more than studio light? Do you do a combination of the two? I've seen images that seem to kind of go across that spectrum.
Yeah, very early on in my work, and maybe it was just a factor of not being as comfortable photographing outside, because certainly it's not like there's spaces in North Carolina. It's like, sure, get naked, take pictures. That I was doing a lot of studio work at home, and so I was using lots of, can lights, things like that, playing around with color. I still do that, but I think now I do a lot more natural light. And in terms of process, like any photographer, I'm looking for how much light I can control that light. So use of blinds, creating, a shaft of light that's coming across a body, things like that. Time of day, of course, that golden hour when the light's nice coming through the windows.
Yeah.
So yeah, I tend more natural light these days. I just like how it interacts with the body.
Well, let's talk about um, your queer identity and your relationship with the community. What ways do you think? And we talked a little bit about this already, right? You're attracted to the muscle bear, but you also want to have a variety of men in your work, which I appreciate, not being a muscle bear. But how does your identity, maybe as a queer man, also influence your work outside of that
Yeah.
aspect?
Certainly hair influences me. I think identity wise, me coming out in the late 80s, early 90s, when bear culture was just kind of getting started, there's definitely a part of me that saw how gay culture shifted from
Mhm.
hairless to, now it seems like hair is more celebrated. So that's definitely there. It's still interesting to me when a guy that I want to photograph says, "Well, do I need to shave my body for?" And I'm like, "Why would you do that?" So yeah, there's that aspect. I've been out since I'm 22 years old. So how else does it influence me? I
How
think
do
I think
Go ahead.
the things that influence me more now have to do with my career in education and starting to understand and underscore issues of diversity, inclusion, things like that. So I worked for a while in support for people with disabilities, and so that also played into my thought in terms of um, how you celebrate lots of different shapes and forms.
How do you see your work contributing to representation of queer individuals in the arts?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to what I was talking about finding a space in the middle. And this goes back to my experiences in the yoga class as well. I still wonder if our identity, if we sexualize everything to the extreme, And so I do wonder if there's space for us to celebrate the body without sexualizing the body. And so I guess where I feel like my work might contribute to that is seeing men as beautiful without necessarily sexualizing them. It is interesting to me sometimes when I get comments on my work where clearly people are interacting with my work as porn, and I get just frankly a bit offended because I'm like, wait a second, this was not what I was trying to do. And so, um, there is a piece of me, I guess, that feels like I think it's important that we can separate those things out and celebrate nakedness without sexuality, as well as nakedness with sexuality. So, if that makes sense.
I think it's a little easier sometimes to celebrate nakedness without the sexuality in the queer community than I think maybe the straight community can, because we're so comfortable with we become much more comfortable with our bodies, some of us,
Hmm.
and we're comfortable being naked around each other, and so I find it much more accepting in the queer community to be a non-sexual thing. Have you worked with any queer organizations on collaboration projects or?
Not in the photography realm. No.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about kind of your challenges in the growth of your art. What challenges do you think you faced in your photography career, such that it is, since you said you're not a professional photographer? What challenges do you face, especially maybe even as a queer man? Um, and how do you overcome them?
I mean, the first is just obvious when you're not a full time photographer. It's something that, if you do it well, demands a good amount of time. And so carving that time out, for someone who's not a photographer, just understanding that the actual time it takes to take the photos is just a fraction of the time actually that you're putting into processing and, all those kinds of things. So, when I take those 2,000 images and pull them down to 20 and then process and all that kind of stuff, I guess just the challenge is time for one.
Yeah, I certainly relate to that.
I I do find it difficult. Maybe it's from my own identity being in the South. I find it difficult to, particularly men of color, attracting them to do and feel comfortable being naked. I think it might be easier for me were I in larger cities to find models. I find it extremely challenging here in North Carolina. And so I'm constantly figuring out how do I reach out more to men of color to, invite. But I also think there's a dynamic there. I don't know if it's just the South or if it's more just American psyche, but about identity as a man of color and being naked. So I don't know.
Especially a queer man of color.
Yes, and so I that's just something that's always on my mind to figure out and do more of. So
How do you think your work has evolved since you first started? How many years did you say you've been doing it?
it's been about 10 years.
10 years. How do you think it's evolved?
Certainly, my photography skills have gotten better. Um, in terms of just knowing what I want to do with the camera, those kinds of things. I think one of the things I mentioned to you about I'm drawn more and more to natural light, more towards outdoor settings, how it's evolving. It's interesting. I have been asking myself that question recently, just how do I move? What's next for me? Those kinds of things. I'm constantly trying, like new activities or texture or things like that. Water, what's the difference in using paint or something like that as I'm thinking about textural stuff with the body. I sometimes wonder if I'm painting myself into a box, but I really want to photograph the male form naked, not necessarily using what I would call props,
Hmm.
a hat, underwear, a jock, or those kinds of things. And so um, I guess I'm just always playing around with the tension of that.
Gotcha. Um, every artist, I think, gets the occasional creative block. I know I do. How do you handle that? Where do you find the inspiration to go towards that next project? do something different.
Often it's the person I meet that gets me out of a particular block. If there's someone new or different just to photograph, it may give me different ideas. Sometimes it's the collaboration with the model. And that's the reason I really believe in having that conversation if I can. Ben was a model I worked with about 4 or 5 years ago, and he was just phenomenal because I would contact him for a shoot at this point, and he would say, "Here's my list of 10 things I want to try," and I was like, "Oh, great!" So there was constant give and take with Ben on figuring out like what we wanted to try. He was also a bit of a risk taker, and so I liked that collaboration. So that kind of moves me beyond. Unfortunately, when I do get blocked, though, sometimes I just step back. I'm like, take a break from it.
Break from it. Do you have a slate of models that you like to work with regularly, or do you try to always work with somebody new each time?
No, I'll definitely do repeat shoots with some of the models, but I'll say I also like the variety of working with someone new, those kinds of things too. So I think it's kind of a little bit on both.
New sets of inspirations, new dynamics.
Right.
Yeah,
Most of the models that I've worked with that I want to repeat though are far away, and so there's just the challenge of when are we going to see each other next.
time and space. Yeah. Um, so let's talk about the future a little bit. What upcoming projects or themes do you have that you're working on, that you're looking forward to and excited to explore?
People often ask me if I want to try a book at some point, and I don't think that's on. I just think there's too much competition for a book, but I wouldn't rule it out. I certainly have a portfolio of enough images at this point that I could look at
Oh,
that
absolutely.
as an option. But um, I like working towards particular, proposals. Like, when Mascular puts out a particular proposal and says, do this, that gives me a new lens to work towards.
Hmm.
Really appreciate that they have published published me a couple of times. And I really appreciate their kind of focus and lens. So I think, working towards that particular type of a shoot. Um, I do want to do more kind of pushing myself out of cisgender male kind of gay nudity at this point too, and kind of break some of those boundaries at some point. I do love David from Atlanta, the recent work that he's done with drag queens, and like it's just phenomenal stuff. And so that's the kind of stuff I think I would like to try some and see where I can get my brain into a different spot.
I think photographing drag queens could probably be
But yeah,
very fun time. Just the
yeah,
camp and
I'm a
the
huge fan
amount
of
of stuff that
RuPaul.
you
Like
could play
I
with.
watch RuPaul religiously, so it's like if I ever had the chance, that'd be fun to try.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you ever have experiments to, or not experiments, aspirations to experiment with other forms of art? Or do you just like sticking with photography?
No, not just aspirations, but I'm constantly on the move with regard to art. So I also do some writing. My photography is not just of men. I do lots of different types of photography. I have been a painter. I have worked in stained glass. I do some woodworking. So I'm constantly, I just like to be creative.
Nice. Do you ever incorporate your male aesthetic into those other mediums?
Not really. No, I haven't really. Those two worlds don't really cross.
Gotcha. What what impact do you think that or that you hope that your work will have on your viewers and the broader public, and the queer artistic community?
I think some of what we talked about a little bit before in finding that space in the middle. I don't know. I could be wrong, but I think that we're at a point in time where something that is very raw is more um, popular. And it's interesting to me. I don't know if I'm sometimes just a throwback to a previous period of art or something, but I kind of see myself as a bit of a romanticist. And so I don't know. I just wonder if there's space for continuing to see some romanticism in the male figure. But
What role do you think that queer art can play in uh, the the climate we have today, What role do you think it can play in protest and civil rights?
I do think that clothes represent um, I'm not going to articulate this well, but being clothed, maybe it's RuPaul, everything is drag, is that clothing in a way is representative of the kind of rules that we throw on ourselves as a society, and so I think when you see the male form naked and it's accepted and it's beautiful, that it's a way of letting go. It's a way of letting go of a lot of um, messages growing up that need to be broken and rewritten. And so I don't think that's just specific. I think I am in the space where I'm photographing men, but I think queer art is in the space where it can break those rules and break them beautifully. So
Agreed. And last question for you. A lot of our listeners and our readers are young queer artists at various stages of their careers. What advice would you give someone who's young in their artistic career, who's playing in that queer art space? What advice would you give them to inspire them to keep going?
just keep shooting. I mean, even when you feel like you're not producing something that you feel like others appreciate, just keep shooting, and just put your work out there, and someone's going to start responding to it. It's interesting to me, I'm 59. I started this process when I was 49. It's interesting to me, not even being a young artist in this, it's just that there's a space for any age of an artist kind of coming forth and sharing their work.
Absolutely. It's never too late to start drawing, painting,
Right.
photographing. Well, Tom, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate the conversation. It was very enjoyable meeting you. I
Yeah.
look forward to seeing what new photographs you have coming out in the future. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Thanks for listening or watching. If you love this show, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us bring more visibility to queer artists and their work. And check out our website at salonnatural.art for more queer art events and discussions.